The year is 1763, and the colonists are restless. The period of salutary neglect has ended, a period where the colonists weren't directly ruled by Britain and has means of self-governance. During this, colonists developed their own town hall meetings and county-style government, essentially whatever they thought would be good for their colony structure. With the proclamation line, which Chris will discuss later, the period of Great Britain not having an impact on the colonists' life has effectively ended. Another thing that has the colonists frustrated is the concept of mercantilism. Mercantilism is the economic idea that the country should export more than they do import in order to accumulate wealth. Britain believed in this idea. They applied this by using their colonies in North America. The colonies would send their raw materials like lumber to Great Britain. Great Britain would turn those into manufactured goods and send them back to North America and sell them at the price they wished upon.
The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, began in 1754 and was fought between the French and the British with the support of native tribes, namely the Iroquois, Catawba, and the Cherokee, in support of the British. This conflict was the first of its kind as it was fought not only in America, but also in Europe, the West Indies, Africa, the Philippines, and in the ocean. The war, lasting until 1763, ended in French defeat and, more importantly, granted British all French territory east of the Mississippi and Spanish Florida, however leaving Cuba to the Spanish. After the British took vast amounts of territory from the French per the French and Indian War, they were in heavy debt. As to not grow the debt, King George created the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonists from settling in the newly acquired land between the colonies and the Mississippi River, in order to eliminate further conflict with natives. However, the colonists did not like the proclamation, and many colonists still ventured into the natives' land and laid claim to small or large areas of land against the will of the crown. Even prominent figures such as George Washington wanted a part of the vast forbidden land.
Mercantilism up until 1763 wasn't necessarily such a bad deal for the colonists, especially since the London government paid a good price for all the American raw goods, as well as the law that legalized this practice. The Navigation Law Act of 1650 wasn't that strongly enforced. However, in 1763, it started to begin strictly enforced, continuing the series of laws on British colonial commerce that began in 1650. The goal was for Britain to crack down on smuggling in the Americas in order to extract wealth to pay back their debt. This enrages the colonies, especially New England. Another act that Britain passes in order to extract wealth from the colonies is the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required a tax on all paper goods. This was one of the most irritating taxes, since the colonists had to directly pay for it. For every marriage license, legal document, newsletter, or even playing cards, the paper had to have a royal stamp on it to certify for the tax. Remember, grain isn't one of the biggest debts they've ever had until this point. Is a sum of 140 million pounds. British officials, in particular the Prime Minister George Grenville, deems this just. He's simply asking for the colonists to pay their fair share. The Britons had been paying the Stamp Act for at least 2 decades, even before the colonists started paying for it. Nevertheless, the colonists had a growing distrust towards their mother country.
Occurring on March 5, 1770, the Boston Massacre began as a large group of colonists were mocking a group of 10 soldiers in front of Boston's Old State House. The agitated soldiers opened fire at once and killed 5 colonists, leaving 6 wounded. However, the colonists were also to blame for this event, as they were taunting and mocking the soldiers. As a result, only 2 soldiers were put on trial, being quickly released with the small punishment of a branding on the hand, further causing outrage by colonists about the unequal court system. The East India Company facing bankruptcy and the British government in fear of losing tax revenue, the British government gave the British East India Company the monopoly on the American tea business. While the tea coming from the British East India Company may have been much cheaper than before, the colonists would have rather paid a higher price for their tea than succumb to paying British tax. And subsequently, the colonists sent back or even burned ships carrying tea to America. However, in Boston, British officials did not give in to the colonists' rage, and Thomas Hutchinson ordered the ships to unload their tea before sailing off. Outraged, around 100 colonists, clad as Indians, boarded the tea-bearing ships and destroyed 342 chests, dumping the contents into the water on December 16, 1773. This became known as the Boston Tea Party.
During the opposition of the Stamp Act in 1765, Samuel Adams played a big role in convincing the colonies to rebel against the British government. He is often credited with being the founder and leader of the Boston Sons of Liberty. Throughout the 1760s and 1770s, he wrote many articles for Boston newspapers that opposed the British government's actions. Samuel Adams helped coordinate the Boston Tea Party, an act of rebellion against the Tea Act. He later went on to represent Massachusetts in the Continental Congress. Another leading figure in the Revolution was Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin served in the Second Continental Congress, which occurred shortly after the Revolutionary War began. He also testified against the Stamp Act in British Parliament. Benjamin Franklin was also part of the group that drafted the Declaration of Independence. Later, he would also negotiate and draft the Treaty of Paris, which marked the end of the Revolutionary War. The Sons of Liberty was a group formed in order to rebel against the actions from the British Parliament that they thought were unfair. This group was responsible for organizing and carrying out the famous Boston Tea Party. The Sons of Liberty was most likely created as an opposition to the Stamp Act imposed on the colonists by the British. Their motto was "No taxation without representation." The Second Continental Congress met after the Redcoats stormed Boston for the second time. At this point, the Revolutionary War had already begun. Representatives from each colony met together to discuss how to solve these issues. In 1776, the Congress took the first step in declaring independence from Britain. Later, the Congress ratified the Articles of Confederation, which governed the country until 1789, when the U.S. Constitution was formed.